Mr. Flynn's plea deal could deeply undercut the claims made in January by Mr. Trump and his aides that they were misled by Mr. Flynn about his discussion with Russians regarding sanctions imposed on Moscow by the Obama administration over the election interference. In fact, the documents say multiple members of the team coordinated the specifics of Mr. Flynn's outreach to Russia and knew that the conversations were about sanctions. Mr. Flynn's agreement also provided new context for Mr. Trump's efforts to get F.B.I. officials to back off their investigation of Mr. Flynn. James B. Comey, the former F.B.I. director, has said that the president asked him to shut down the investigation one day after Mr. Flynn was fired in February. "I hope you can let this go," the president said, according to congressional testimony by Mr. Comey. The information provided by Mr. Flynn, who promised to provide prosecutors with information on any and all matters, suggests one possible motivation for the president's efforts to shut down the Flynn investigation. To avoid revealing the deep involvement of his top transition officials in Mr. Flynn's discussions with Mr. Kislyak in May, the president fired Mr. Comey as well and said the Russia investigation was on his mind at the time. Mr. Mueller is investigating whether Mr. Trump's firings of Mr. Comey or Mr. Flynn amount to obstruction of justice. Mr. Trump made no public comments on Friday, though Mr. Flynn's plea provided an awkward backdrop for a closed-door holiday reception for members of the press corps at the White House. Ty Cobb, the president's lawyer dealing with the Russia inquiry, played down the potential impact of Mr. Flynn's deal, saying that Mr. Flynn served only briefly in the administration and had pleaded guilty to just a single count of lying to the FBI. Nothing about the guilty plea or the charge implicates anyone other than Mr. Flynn. Quote, Mr. Cobb said in a statement. But while the court documents released on Friday show no direct evidence of collusion with Russia, the special counsel's filings so far paint a damning portrait of Mr. Trump's associates. His former campaign chairman, two other campaign aides and his former national security advisor have now all been charged with felonies. In a statement, Mr. Flynn, 58, denied false accusations of treason, but said that he had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors, who are examining whether Mr. Trump's campaign colluded with Russians during the election and whether anyone sought to cover it up. I recognize that the actions I acknowledged in court today were wrong, and, through my faith in God, I am working to set things right. Quote, Mr. Flynn said, my guilty plea and agreement to cooperate with the special counsel's office reflect a decision I made in the best interests of my family and of our country. I accept full responsibility for my actions. Quote, Friday's 45-minute hearing in federal court in Washington was a humiliating moment for Mr. Flynn, a decorated Army general who had risen to lead the Defense Intelligence Agency but was fired by Mr. Obama before joining the Trump campaign. Dressed in a crisp gray suit, Mr. Flynn arrived at the courtroom with his wife, holding hands. They occasionally traded glances, and her legs trembled before prosecutors laid out their case that Mr. Flynn had repeatedly lied to investigators about his dealings with Russia and his lobbying on behalf of the Turkish government. Mr. Flynn's plea agreement requires his full cooperation. He agreed to take a polygraph and, if asked, to participate in covert law enforcement activities. Such undercover activities are unlikely. However, since the plea agreement was filed publicly,